I never bragged to my family that my private equity fund pulls in over $250,000 a month. I came back to their luxury Atlanta penthouse without warning, wearing faded thrift store jeans, pretending I had just lost my job. I wanted to see their reaction, to see if the overwhelming grief over my grandfather passing away had finally softened their historically cold and calculating hearts. But before I even managed to step past the foyer, they showed me exactly who they were. My name is Simone. I am 34 years old, and what my family did not know was that they were about to lose the very empire they were boasting about. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to expose toxic relatives. Standing outside the mahogany double doors of my parents' penthouse in Buckhead, my stomach tightened. I smoothed the wrinkled fabric of the oversized beige sweater I had deliberately chosen from the back of my closet. The brass knocker felt heavy in my hand. When the door swung open, my mother Evelyn stood there, dressed in a pristine black tailored suit that probably cost more than my first car. Her initial shock quickly dissolved into a familiar mask of sheer disdain. Her eyes swept over my scuffed sneakers and unstyled hair. I did not even get a chance to offer my condolences for grandfather before she spoke. "You cannot be seen looking like a homeless person today, Simone," she hissed, checking the hallway to ensure none of their affluent neighbors were watching. "We are hosting the city elite for the wake tomorrow." I forced a look of desperation onto my face. "Mom, I need help," I said, keeping my voice small and trembling. "I just lost my job. I have nothing left. Can I stay here for a few days until after the funeral?" My mother physically recoiled, as if my supposed poverty was a contagious disease. She crossed her arms, the diamond bracelets clinking against each other. "Absolutely not," she snapped. "We are already dealing with enough stress making the arrangements. The last thing your father needs is the embarrassment of his daughter begging for handouts in front of the entire congregation. You always do this. You always find a way to make everything about your failures." Before I could respond, the private elevator chimed behind me. The polished doors slid open to reveal my older brother Marcus and his wife Chloe. They stepped out carrying an assortment of glossy shopping bags. He wore a custom-tailored morning suit that screamed old money. Chloe, his white wife, who constantly paraded her proximity to black wealth as a personality trait, stared at me with wide, exaggerated pity that felt completely manufactured. "Well, look who decided to show up," Marcus sneered. "Did you run out of money playing independent woman downtown?" I looked at my brother, maintaining my pathetic facade. "I got laid off, Marcus. I just need a place to crash for the weekend to pay my respects to grandfather." Chloe let out a theatrical sigh, stepping closer to Marcus and resting a manicured hand on his chest. "Oh, honey," she crooned, her voice dripping with condescension. "We simply cannot afford a freeloader right now. We are planning the largest memorial this city has ever seen. The catering alone is taking all our attention. We cannot be distracted by your financial ruin, Simone. It is just not the right time for your drama." I looked at Chloe, feeling a cold realization wash over me. She had been in this family for exactly 2 years, yet she felt perfectly entitled to stand outside the home my grandfather bought and tell his biological granddaughter that she was a burden. She weaponized her position as the wife of the golden child flawlessly. "I am not asking for money, Chloe," I said calmly. "I am asking my family for a bed." The commotion in the hallway brought my father Richard to the front door. When he saw me standing there in my faded clothes, his face hardened into a mask of pure disgust. "What is this commotion?" he demanded, stepping past my mother. I looked at him, hoping to find a shred of parental warmth. "Dad, I lost my job. I just need a place to stay for the funeral." My father let out a harsh, barking laugh. He looked me up and down with absolute revulsion. "A place to stay? he repeated loudly. "You think this penthouse is a charity shelter. You turned your back on the family business 5 years ago to prove a point. Now you come crawling back the moment you go broke, right when the patriarch dies. It is pathetic." I stood my ground, memorizing every word, every sneer, every cruel expression on their faces. "You are turning me away on the day we are supposed to be mourning grandfather?" I asked, letting a final plea enter my voice. My father stepped forward, his imposing frame blocking the warm light of the foyer. He looked me dead in the eyes, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly cold whisper. "Do not even think about showing up to the funeral tomorrow if you are looking for a handout. You will ruin the family aesthetic." He reached out and grabbed the brass handle of the heavy mahogany door. "You made your choice, Simone. Right now, live with it." The heavy wooden door slammed shut right in my face, the loud echo ringing in my ears. I stood alone in the pristine hallway, staring at the very closed door. I did not cry. I did not beg. Instead, a slow, cold smile spread across my face. They had absolutely no idea that I did not need a single dime of their money. They had no idea that I already owned the very building they were standing in. The very next following afternoon, the massive cathedral was packed to the brim with Atlanta elite. My family transformed his passing into a grotesque networking event. The floral arrangements cascaded down the aisles in obnoxious displays of wealth. I stood very quietly in the back row wearing a modest black dress, blending into the shadows while my family held court near the casket. My mother, Evelyn, was working the room like a politician, shaking hands and accepting condolences with practiced tears that dried the second an important investor walked away. Chloe and Marcus were right beside her, acting like grieving royalty. Chloe wore a black lace veil, looking more appropriate for a movie set than a church. I watched my father Richard approach the pulpit. The sanctuary fell silent, expecting a touching eulogy about the man who built our family legacy from nothing. Instead, my father adjusted his expensive tie and gripped the podium with a sickeningly triumphant smile. He spoke briefly about my grandfather, before seamlessly pivoting to the future of our empire. He discussed expansion strategies, treating the memorial like a shareholder meeting. I felt my nails bite into my palms. My grandfather was a hard-working, self-made man who despised this kind of shallow performance. Seeing my father use his casket as a prop made my blood boil, but I maintained my composure, waiting. My father cleared his throat, leaning into the microphone to ensure his voice echoed. "As many of you know, my father built a colossal enterprise," he announced, his chest puffing out with unearned pride. "I am here to assure our partners and friends that the transition of power will be seamless." We searched his office, his home, and his private safes. He did not leave a will. A collective murmur ran through the pews. No will meant the estate automatically passed to the next of kin. It meant my father was publicly staking his claim on everything my grandfather had built. My father raised a hand to quiet the crowd. "As his only son, I will be inheriting the entire estate to manage on behalf of the family." He puffed out his chest, projecting absolute authority. "And I want to make it perfectly clear today that the future of this empire rests solely in capable hands. I am officially naming my son Marcus as the next heir and executive vice president." Marcus stood up from the front pew, buttoning his custom suit, and offered a smug nod to the crowd. Chloe clapped louder than anyone else, her diamond rings catching the light. But my father was not finished. His eyes scanned the crowd, looking past the wealthy donors and socialites, until he found me standing in the very back. The church was massive, but his glare locked onto me with laser precision. He pointed a finger toward the shadows. "I also want to address the rumors regarding my daughter Simone," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "Some of you have asked if she will be returning to the company now that my father has passed. Let me be clear. Simone is a disappointment to this family." The entire congregation turned in their pews to stare at me, hundreds of eyes judging me, whispering about my faded clothes and my isolated position at the back of the church. She abandoned our legacy years ago to pursue her own selfish delusions. My father continued, his voice echoing off the stained glass windows. "She has failed in the real world, and she brings nothing but shame to our name. She will not get a single cent of this inheritance. She has no place in our empire, and she never will. The public humiliation was calculated and brutal. He wanted to ensure that no one in that room would ever hire me or associate with me. He wanted to break my spirit completely and permanently. My mother Evelyn nodded in agreement from the front row, while Chloe whispered something to Marcus and giggled. They were parading my supposed failure to elevate their own status. I felt the heavy weight of their collective judgment, but I refused to lower my head. I stared right back at my father, holding his gaze with a cold, steady expression that clearly unnerved him. He expected me to run out of the church in tears. Instead, I stood there like a statue, memorizing every single face that laughed at my expense. As my father stepped down from the pulpit to a round of inappropriate applause, the congregation began to disperse for the reception. I remained in the back corner watching the grotesque celebration unfold. The hypocrisy of it all was suffocating. They were dividing up the spoils of a man they barely respected while his body was not even cold. I was just about to turn and leave when I felt a sudden presence beside me. A tall, older man wearing a sharp gray suit stepped out of the alcove shadows. I knew him instantly. It was Lawyer Sterling, my grandfather's most trusted legal advisor, and the very only person in the entire world who truly knew the absolute truth about the family finances. He ignored my parents and my brother. He kept his eyes fixed entirely on me, his expression serious and respectful. He reached inside his tailored jacket and pulled out a thick envelope secured with a deep red wax seal. The seal bore my grandfather's personal insignia. Lawyer Sterling pressed the heavy envelope firmly into my hands. The thick parchment felt solid against my skin, a stark contrast to the hollow lies echoing through the church. I looked down at the red wax and then up at the lawyer. He leaned in close, ensuring that no one else in the crowded room could hear his words over the loud networking and forced laughter of my family. He whispered, his voice carrying the weight of a meticulously planned retaliation. "It is time to tell them who you really are." I walked out of the cathedral without looking back. The humid Atlanta air hit my face, but the heavy envelope in my hands grounded me. I bypassed the valet section where my father parked his leased Bentley. I walked 3 blocks down to a secured underground parking garage. My driver nodded respectfully as I approached the sleek black Maybach, hidden away from my family prying eyes. I climbed into the spacious leather-back seat and instructed my driver to keep the privacy partition raised. The silence inside the cabin was absolute. I ran my fingers over the deep red wax seal, feeling the raised crest of my grandfather's signet ring. He never did anything without a calculated reason. I broke the wax with a sharp snap and pulled out the thick stack of legal parchment. The crisp pages felt heavy with power. The first page bore the bold letterhead of Sterling and Associates, the most ruthless corporate law firm in the entire state of Georgia. I skimmed the dense legal jargon until I reached the core declaration. It was an irrevocable trust established exactly 3 years ago. The date jumped out at me immediately. It was the exact same week my father had viciously ousted me from the family business and claimed my startup ideas as his own. My grandfather had seen everything happen. He had witnessed the terrible betrayal and chosen his true successor in absolute secrecy. I turned to the next page and my breath caught in my throat. My grandfather had legally transferred 100% of his holding company into this private trust. He named me as the sole primary beneficiary and the ultimate executive authority. Every single subsidiary, every real estate asset, every corporate account was bound to this trust. There were no loopholes, no hidden clauses, and absolutely no exceptions. I owned it all. I flipped through the asset schedules, reading the detailed breakdown of the empire my father had just claimed as his own. A cold, sharp laugh escaped my lips. Richard thought he was the king of the world, but he was nothing more than a glorified middle manager. He was a mere employee working under my direct supervision. My grandfather had structured the holding company so that the executive board operated entirely under the shadow of the trust. My father was a puppet chief executive officer running a completely hollowed-out shell. He had the fancy title, the corner office, and the corporate credit cards, but he possessed absolutely zero equity. Every major financial move he made required the silent approval of the trust administrator. And now that incredible power belonged exclusively to me. He was standing on that church pulpit selling shares of a grand kingdom he did not even legally own. I leaned back against the plush leather seat, staring at the signature at the bottom of the page. My grandfather had signed his name with the same bold strokes he used to build his massive fortune. He knew my father was driven by massive ego rather than actual business acumen. He knew Marcus lacked the basic discipline to lead anything. He knew Chloe was just a parasite feeding off a false legacy. They were completely blinded by their own greed and social status. They thought my faded clothes and my quiet silence meant I was broken and defeated. They had absolutely no idea I spent the last 5 years building my own private equity firm, mastering the very financial warfare they thought I was too weak to handle. I had spent thousands of hours studying market trends, negotiating ruthless acquisitions, and quietly multiplying the initial seed money my grandfather had secretly given me before he became ill. My success was quiet, but it was lethal. I did not need their validation because I had my own capital. I folded the important documents and placed them carefully back into the thick envelope. The game had changed. I was no longer the outcast daughter begging for a place at the family table. I owned the table, the building, and the ground it stood on. They were completely living in my own world now. I instructed my driver to head toward my grandfather's old estate. It was a modest, historic brick home in a quiet neighborhood. My grandfather had explicitly allowed me to reside there after my parents threw me out into the cold street. I kept the property meticulously maintained, honoring his memory in quiet solitude. It was the only place that truly felt like home. As the Maybach merged onto the busy highway, my phone vibrated rapidly in my purse. I pulled it out and saw an urgent push notification from my smart home security system. Motion detected at the front door. I tapped the alert, opening the live camera feed on my screen. The high-definition video buffered for a second before displaying a crystal-clear image of my front porch. Marcus and Chloe were standing there on my doorstep. Chloe was still wearing her expensive funeral attire, complaining loudly about the humidity while swatting at a mosquito. Her designer heels were sinking slightly into the soft grass of the front yard. Marcus was pointing aggressively at the front wooden door, giving direct instructions to a man wearing a blue utility shirt. It was a local locksmith drilling directly into the old brass deadbolt of the house. Bright sparks flew from the heavy steel drill bit as the metal gave way. The loud grinding noise echoed clearly through the audio feed on my phone. Marcus and Chloe were actively changing the locks on the home where I currently lived. They were not even waiting for the funeral reception to end before trying to throw me out onto the street. They felt so incredibly entitled to everything my grandfather owned that they were ready to seize it by brute force. I zoomed in closely on the video feed, watching Chloe smile wickedly as the heavy metal lock finally clicked open. The heavy metal lock finally clicked open. I tapped the partition glass and told my driver to step on the gas. He navigated the downtown traffic with aggressive precision, but by the time we turned onto the quiet suburban street, the scene had already escalated into complete chaos. I instructed him to park 2 blocks away, keeping the Maybach hidden behind a row of tall oak trees. I needed them to believe I was still the broke, helpless sister they had discarded. Walking down the pavement, my heart pounded with a cold fury. A massive white moving truck was already backed into the driveway, crushing my grandfather's perfectly manicured rose bushes. 4 large men in gray uniforms were hauling my belongings out the front door. I watched in absolute disbelief as they tossed my winter coats, my carefully organized boxes of books, and even my kitchenware directly onto the damp front lawn. Chloe stood on the porch directing the men like a tyrannical general. She held a cup of artisan coffee, pointing her manicured finger at a box containing my framed college degrees. "Just toss that garbage near the trash bins," she yelled over the engine noise. "We need this entire space cleared out before the interior designers arrive tomorrow." Marcus stood beside her, completely ignoring the destruction of my property, while he typed furiously on his phone, probably bragging to his friends about his new inheritance. I walked right up the driveway, my sneakers crunching against the scattered debris of my own life. "Stop right there," I commanded. My voice was not loud, but it carried a sharp, undeniable authority that made two of the movers freeze immediately. Marcus looked up from his phone, his face twisting into a scowl. "I thought Dad told you to get lost," he snapped, stepping down from the porch to block my path. "This house belongs to me now, Simone. Grandfather is gone and I am the heir. You have exactly zero right to be here. We are doing you a favor by moving your junk out so you do not have to carry it." I ignored my brother entirely and turned my attention to the men holding my heavy mahogany desk. "Put that down immediately," I said, keeping my tone perfectly even. "If you move that desk one more inch, you will be held liable for destruction of private property and trespassing." The movers hesitated, looking nervously between me and Marcus. Chloe scoffed, marching down the porch steps to confront me. She positioned herself right in my face, her cheap perfume suffocating the fresh air. "Listen to me, you pathetic loser," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "This is our property now. We are building a nursery for my baby in your old room. You are homeless and you are nothing. Grab your trash and leave before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked down at her with a chilling calm. "You do not own this house, Chloe," I stated firmly. "You are committing a felony by breaking and entering. Tell these men to put my belongings back inside, or I will press charges against you and your husband for burglary." My absolute lack of fear caught her off guard. She expected me to cry, to beg, or to scream. When I did none of those things, her expression shifted from smug entitlement to sudden panic. She realized she could not bully me, so she instantly deployed her ultimate weapon. Without a second of hesitation, Chloe's face crumpled. Her eyes welled up with massive crocodile tears, and she began to hyperventilate. She stumbled backward, clutching her slightly rounded belly with both hands. "Oh my God, Marcus," she wailed, her voice echoing down the entire street. "She is threatening me. She is trying to hurt the baby. Get her away from me." She sobbed hysterically, stumbling into Marcus' arms and burying her face in his chest. It was a masterful performance of white tears designed entirely to cast the calm black woman as the aggressive villain. Marcus held her tightly, glaring at me with absolute hatred. "Are you insane, Simone?" he yelled, pointing a finger in my face. "You are attacking a pregnant woman. You are completely out of control." I stood there watching the grotesque theatrical display without moving a single muscle. "You are putting on a great show, Chloe," I said, my voice steady and completely unbothered. "But crying does not change the law, and it certainly does not change the fact that you broke into my home." The movers had completely stopped working now, exchanging uncomfortable glances as they watched the dramatic scene unfold. Just as Chloe let out another piercing sob, a sleek silver Mercedes SUV turned the corner and screeched to a halt right behind the moving truck. The doors flew open, and my parents, Richard and Evelyn, rushed out. They had clearly rushed over straight from the funeral reception, still wearing their expensive black mourning attire. Evelyn's face was a mask of pure fury as she took in the scene. She saw Chloe sobbing hysterically in Marcus' arms, holding her pregnant stomach. She saw me standing tall and unbothered amidst my scattered belongings on the front lawn. Without asking a single question, without demanding any explanation whatsoever, my mother stormed across the damp grass. Her high heels dug into the dirt as she marched directly toward me. I opened my mouth to explain that they had broken the locks, but the words never had a chance to escape. Evelyn raised her hand and struck me across the face with everything she had. The sharp crack of her palm against my cheek echoed loudly, cutting through the noise of the moving truck, and Chloe, fake sobbing. The impact snapped my head to the side, stinging my skin and leaving a burning red handprint. My father stood right behind her, looking proud. The stinging heat on my cheek radiated across my face, but I refused to raise my hand to touch the bright red mark she had just left. I kept my posture perfectly rigid, holding my mother's furious gaze. Evelyn pointed a shaking, manicured finger at me, her chest heaving with heavy breaths. "How dare you threaten a pregnant woman?" she shrieked, her voice cracking with manufactured hysteria. "How dare you bring your bitter, jealous energy to this property after everything we have just been through today? You are a complete and utter monster, Simone." Chloe sniffled loudly, burying her face into Marcus' shoulder, playing the fragile, helpless victim flawlessly. Marcus glared at me, wrapping his strong arms around his wife in a highly exaggerated, protective stance. She was trying to extort us. Marcus lied smoothly, without any hesitation. She said she would not leave the property unless we paid her off immediately. I did not even blink at the blatant, undeniable lie. My father, Richard, stepped forward, pushing my mother gently aside so he could take complete control of the situation. He buttoned his expensive suit jacket with calm arrogance. He looked down at me as if I were a diseased pest that needed to be exterminated from his pristine new lawn. "You have caused enough scenes for one day, Simone," he declared, his voice booming across the yard to ensure the moving crew heard every single word. I watched as he took a deep, arrogant breath, intentionally puffing out his chest to assert his dominance. "This house no longer belongs to my father. It belongs to me now, and I am transferring it to Marcus and Chloe to raise their family. You are officially trespassing on private property, and you are being formally evicted effective immediately." He reached into his tailored breast pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He threw it directly at my chest. The paper fluttered down onto my scattered belongings. "Consider that your final notice," he sneered. "It is a fully itemized ledger of the debt you owe this family. You have bled us dry for years, and I will not allow you to drain my son's inheritance." I glanced down at the paper resting on the grass. Without breaking eye contact with my father, I slowly bent down and picked it up. It was a completely fabricated invoice. It listed hundreds of thousands of dollars in supposed loans, living expenses, and financial bailouts that I had never received. He was attempting to frame me as a delinquent debtor to justify seizing the estate. It was a calculated maneuver to bury me in fake liabilities before I could claim my own grandfather real estate. "You really have no shame, Dad," I said, keeping my tone dangerously calm. "You forge a debt document to kick me out of the only home grandfather allowed me to keep." Richard let out a loud, patronizing laugh that made the movers snicker. "I forged nothing," he mocked, stepping closer so he could loom over me. "You owe us for every single cent we wasted trying to clean up your pathetic failures. Or have you magically forgotten the mess you made 5 years ago?" My jaw clenched. 5 years ago, I had built a revolutionary logistics software platform from scratch. I had written every line of code, secured the initial beta testers, and pitched the business plan to my father, hoping for a simple seed investment. Instead, Richard took my business plan, locked me out of the servers, and handed the functional company over to Marcus. He rebranded it, parading my brother as a tech visionary while I was left with nothing. When I threatened to sue, my own father had blacklisted me from every major investment firm in the city, labeling me a disgruntled, unstable employee. "You failed, Simone," my father spat, rewriting history right there on the front lawn. "You crashed that startup into the ground, and Marcus had to step in and save the platform to protect the family reputation. We absorbed your massive financial losses. This debt document simply holds you accountable for your incompetence. You should be thanking me today for not taking you to court." I looked down at the forged paper in my hands, and then looked up at the four people standing on the porch. They were a perfectly unified front of pure delusion and greed. They truly believed their own twisted lies. They honestly thought they had completely destroyed me all over again. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not waste my breath trying to argue with a group of narcissistic thieves who had already made up their minds. I simply folded the forged debt document and slid it carefully into my pocket. It would serve as excellent supplementary evidence for my lawyers later. I turned around and walked over to the pile of my belongings scattered across the damp grass. I grabbed my small black overnight bag, ignoring the rest of the items. They were just material things, and I could easily buy 100 times over what they had thrown away. The priceless possessions, the real assets, were already legally secured under my name anyway. Chloe stopped faking her tears long enough to step to the edge of the porch and shout down at me. "That is right, just walk away, you pathetic loser," she screamed, her voice echoing loudly down the entire suburban street. Evelyn crossed her arms tightly over her chest, adding her own final toxic insult to the situation. "Do not ever call us again, Simone," she sneered. "We are completely done with you." I slung my bag over my shoulder, adjusting the strap. I looked back, offering a chilling, serene smile that made my father falter for a fraction of a second. I turned my back to them and walked steadily down the pavement without looking back. I walked calmly toward my parked car, ready to execute my next move. The heavy tinted door of the hidden Maybach swung open as my private driver stepped out to assist me. I slid into the immaculate leather interior, letting the absolute silence of the soundproof cabin wash over my exhausted senses. The stark contrast between the chaotic screaming on the damp front lawn and the icy tranquility of my luxury vehicle was almost poetic. I placed my small black overnight bag onto the opposite seat and poured myself a tall glass of sparkling water from the chilled center console. My right cheek still throbbed slightly from my violent slap, but the physical sting was entirely overshadowed by the sheer brilliance of the legal weapon currently resting securely inside my designer handbag. I pulled out my phone and dialed a private encrypted number. It rang only half a second before being answered. "Good afternoon, Ms. Sterling," the polished voice of Harrison Cole, my lead wealth manager, echoed clearly through the secure line. He was the senior vice president of the private banking division that handled the massive financial trust my grandfather had formally established. "Harrison," I said, keeping my tone strictly business. "I need an immediate update on the financial activities regarding the holding company and its subsidiary accounts. My father and brother seem extraordinarily confident today. They just physically evicted me from the historic estate and boldly claimed they are taking full possession of the property to build a brand new nursery." Harrison let out a sharp scoff that bordered on sheer professional disgust. "They are operating under severe delusions of grandeur, Ms. Sterling. We received a highly irregular loan application from Richard and Marcus just 2 short hours ago. They bypassed the standard corporate channels and submitted a direct request to our commercial lending division. They are desperately attempting to secure a massive commercial mortgage." "How massive?" I asked, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my cold, sparkling water. $10 million, Harrison replied, reading the exact figures directly from his secure terminal. "They are trying to leverage the historical estate and 3 other massive commercial properties that currently fall under the holding company umbrella. They want the funds dispersed immediately into a newly created corporate account that Marcus exclusively controls." I leaned back against the plush headrest, staring at the dark ceiling of the luxury Maybach. $10 million. My father and brother were literally trying to mortgage my own house to fundamentally fund whatever shallow vanity project they were launching next. They were so entirely blinded by their greed and so utterly convinced that they successfully inherited the entire empire that they did not even bother to properly check the actual deed of the house they were presently standing in. If they had conducted a simple basic title search, they would have clearly seen the irrevocable trust designation stamped across the public records. Instead, they blindly rushed straight to the bank, driven entirely by their insatiable, desperate appetite for immediate liquid cash. "What exactly are they claiming as their legal proof of ownership for this collateral?" I asked, my voice dropping smoothly into a deadly calm register. Richard submitted a sworn affidavit of heirship. Harrison carefully explained, his tone dripping with deep legal contempt. "He is essentially using his status as the only living son to claim automatic transfer of the estate." He also submitted some very hastily drafted corporate resolutions, signed only by himself and Marcus. From a strict legal standpoint, it is absolute garbage. The underwriting department flagged it immediately because the properties are firmly locked securely inside your personal trust. The banking system automatically blocked the transaction pending your approval. I closed my eyes, picturing my brother's arrogant smirk and my father's puffed-out chest. They had violently thrown me out of my own home using a pathetic forged debt document while simultaneously attempting to commit massive bank fraud using that exact same property. They were enthusiastically digging a dark grave so incredibly deep they would never be able to climb back out. If the bank formally rejected the loan, they would simply try another lender or furiously scramble to find another sneaky way to illegally liquidate the assets. I did not want them scrambling. I wanted them feeling incredibly powerful. I wanted them to fully believe they had completely won, so they would carelessly spend the money they did not actually have. "Harrison," I said, opening my eyes and looking out the heavily tinted window at the passing city skyline. "I want you to completely override the underwriting flags." There was a brief, highly stunned silence on the other end of the secure line. "Ms. Sterling, I must strongly advise against this. Allowing them to knowingly use trust assets as collateral for a personal commercial loan constitutes gross financial misconduct on their part. I am fully aware of the severe legal implications." "Harrison," I replied, a cold, sharp smile spreading across my face, "that is exactly why I want you to approve the loan. If we abruptly block it now, they will just realize the trust exists, and they will have plenty of time to hire lawyers and carefully mount a defense. I do not want them playing defense. I want them to rapidly take the money and blindly spend it. I want them to personally guarantee a $10 million loan using collateral they do not legally own." Harrison caught on immediately, his initial professional hesitation seamlessly transforming into dark realization. "You want to intentionally trap them in a massive federal fraud charge. I want them to hang themselves with their own financial rope," I corrected smoothly. "Process the application. Approve the absolute maximum amount they are boldly asking for. Disperse the $10 million directly into Marcus' new bank account. Let them firmly think they have finally outsmarted everyone and successfully secured their royal inheritance. Consider it successfully done." Ms. Sterling Harrison agreed quickly, typing the authorization commands directly into his system. "The funds will be fully available to them by tomorrow." The funds will be fully available to them by tomorrow. Exactly 1 month later, my family proved just how reckless they truly were. The grand ballroom of the St. Regis Hotel was transformed into an obnoxious display of wealth. They were hosting the official launch party for their new venture, which my father had pompously named the Richard and Marcus Family Investment Fund. According to my wealth manager Harrison, they had already burned through a staggering $150,000 of the fraudulent mortgage loan just to fund this single evening. They rented the most expensive event space, hired a Michelin-starred catering team, and commissioned ice sculptures carved into the shape of their own initials. It was a grotesque monument to their bottomless greed. I stepped out of my Maybach and handed keys to the valet. Tonight I was no longer the destitute sister in faded jeans and scuffed sneakers. Tonight I was dressed for a corporate execution. I wore an emerald green couture gown that hugged my frame perfectly. The silk fabric caught the light, radiating an aura of absolute power and undeniable stealth wealth. I paired it with vintage diamond drop earrings from my grandfather's private collection and a flawless blowout. I did not need an invitation to walk past the velvet ropes. The security guards took one look at my confident posture and the sheer authority I projected and stepped aside to let me enter the lavish ballroom. The moment I crossed the threshold, the smell of expensive champagne and cheap desperation hit me. The room was packed with Atlanta elite politicians, celebrities, and high-level corporate investors. My father Richard was standing near a massive champagne tower holding court with a group of older businessmen. He was wearing a velvet tuxedo jacket, laughing loudly, and slapping his colleagues on the back as if he were a self-made billionaire. Across the room, Marcus was leaning against a private bar, acting like a tech visionary, while trying to impress a group of young venture capitalists. He was bragging about the massive capital he had supposedly raised, unaware that every single dollar he was spending was a federal crime waiting to detonate. I grabbed a flute of champagne from a passing waiter and took a slow, deliberate sip. The audacity of my family was almost impressive. They had stolen my house-forged documents and leveraged my grandfather's entire legacy just to throw a party and pretend they were royalty. They were parading around the ballroom using the stolen $10 million loan to buy fake respect from people who would not look their way if they knew the truth. I walked deeper into the crowded room, letting my emerald gown glide across the polished marble floor. Several heads turned as I passed. A few affluent guests whispered to each other, trying to figure out which Fortune 500 company I represented. I kept my expressions serene, projecting the icy calm of a woman who held the fate of everyone in the room firmly in her manicured hands. I wanted to soak in every single second of their fragile temporary kingdom before I burned it to the ground. I navigated through the sea of designer suits and evening gowns, stopping near a massive floral arrangement to observe my sister-in-law. Chloe was in her element. She was wearing a bright white sequined dress that desperately screamed for attention. She was holding a martini glass draped over the arm of a wealthy politician wife, playing the role of the affluent Southern socialite to perfection. She threw her head back in an exaggerated laugh, making sure the diamond necklace around her throat caught the light. That necklace was purchased just last week using the stolen mortgage funds. She was wearing the evidence of her own incoming federal indictment around her neck. I took another sip of my champagne, my eyes tracking my mother Evelyn. She was hovering near the main entrance, greeting the arriving VIP guests. She wore a dark purple ball gown and a forced plastic smile, greeting everyone with the same rehearsed line about how blessed their family enterprise had become. She looked so satisfied, so validated by the illusion of success they had violently stolen from me. I stepped out from behind the floral arrangement, positioning myself in the main thoroughfare of the ballroom. It only took about 30 seconds for the inevitable to happen. Evelyn turned her head to scan the room for a waiter, and her eyes locked onto mine. The plastic smile instantly vanished from her face. I watched the blood drain from her cheeks, leaving her looking like she had just seen a ghost. Her eyes widened in horror as she took in my appearance. She stared at the emerald couture gown, the diamonds, the flawless presentation, and the undeniable confidence radiating from my posture. This was not the broken, unemployed daughter she had slapped and evicted a month ago. She blinked rapidly, her chest heaving as panic set in. She frantically tapped Chloe on the shoulder, grabbing her arm and pointing discreetly in my direction. Chloe turned around, her annoying laugh dying in her throat. The smug entitlement on her face was replaced by sheer terror. They both realized simultaneously that I was standing close to a group of major investors. I offered them a cold, polite smile and raised my champagne glass in a silent, mocking toast. Evelyn dropped her clutch purse onto a nearby table. She grabbed Chloe by the wrist, and the two of them began marching aggressively across the ballroom floor, darting through the crowd of wealthy guests. Their eyes were wide with frantic desperation, their faces flushed with a mixture of rage and panic. They were making a direct beeline for me, moving with furious urgency to intercept me before I could speak to any of the VIP guests. They tried to corner me, pushing me toward a secluded hallway hidden behind the main ballroom. My mother grabbed my arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into my skin as she forcefully yanked me out of the main thoroughfare. Chloe flanked my other side, ensuring I was completely hidden behind a massive marble pillar away from the prying eyes of the wealthy investors they were trying to impress. "What in the world do you think you are doing here?" Evelyn hissed, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. "How did you even get past security? And where did you steal that dress? You are supposed to be out on the street." I gently pried her fingers off my arm, smoothing the silk fabric of my gown. "I did not steal anything, Mother," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "I simply decided to attend the launch party for this spectacular family fund. I wanted to see exactly how you were spending your new money." Chloe sneered, looking me up and down with absolute contempt. "You are pathetic, Simone. You spent your last remaining pennies renting a designer gown just to sneak in here and beg for a handout. You are so violently jealous of our success that you cannot even let us have one single night to celebrate." I laughed softly, adjusting one of my vintage diamond earrings. "I am not here to beg, Chloe. I am here to observe." Chloe's face twisted into an ugly snarl. She realized her usual insults were completely bouncing off my calm demeanor. She needed a scene. She needed to put me back in my place and completely destroy my flawless presentation. I watched her eyes dart toward a waiter passing by with a silver tray of drinks. Without a moment of hesitation, Chloe snatched a full glass of dark red wine from the tray. She turned back to me, locking her eyes onto mine with a malicious, calculating smirk. "Oops," she whispered under her breath. In one swift, aggressive motion, she hurled the entire glass of red wine directly at my chest. The dark liquid splashed violently against my emerald green silk gown, instantly soaking into the expensive fabric and running down the bodice in thick, ugly streaks. The cold wine seeped through to my skin, but I did not gasp. I did not flinch. I simply stood there, dripping in red wine, staring at her with absolute pity. But Chloe was already launching into her performance. Before the wine even hit the marble floor, she threw her hands up to her face and let out a piercing, dramatic shriek that echoed down the entire hallway and into the main ballroom. "Oh my God," she screamed at the top of her lungs, backing away from me and stumbling against the wall. "Why would you do that? Help me, please, someone help me. She is completely out of control." The loud commotion instantly drew a massive crowd. Dozens of high-profile guests, politicians, and venture capitalists abandoned their conversations and rushed toward the hallway. Marcus and Richard sprinted through the crowd, shoving people aside to reach us. Marcus immediately wrapped his arms around his crying wife, shielding her from me, as if I were a dangerous predator. "What did you do to her?" Marcus roared, his face turning bright red. Chloe buried her face in his velvet jacket, sobbing uncontrollably. "She grabbed my drink and tried to throw it at me." Chloe lied, her voice muffled by his suit. "She is completely unhinged, Marcus. She wants to ruin our baby." The blatant gaslighting was almost breathtaking. They were executing their toxic playbook perfectly. Evelyn quickly positioned herself in front of me, creating a physical wall to block me from the VIP guests. "Please forgive my daughter, everyone," Evelyn announced loudly, using her most sympathetic, heartbroken voice. "She has been dealing with severe mental health struggles ever since she failed out of the corporate world. We have tried everything to get her psychiatric help, but she refuses treatment. She is just so deeply jealous of her brother's success that she stalks us." I looked at the crowd, watching their faces shift from shock to deep pity. My family was actively painting me as a deranged, jealous failure to protect their fragile societal image. They were using my ruined dress and Chloe's fake tears to completely discredit my sanity before I could even utter a single word. My father stepped forward, taking complete control of the narrative. He raised his hands, projecting the calm, authoritative energy of a benevolent patriarch dealing with a heavy family burden. "Ladies and gentlemen, I sincerely apologize for this unfortunate disruption," Richard declared, his voice booming with fake sorrow. "We built this family investment fund to create a legacy of excellence, but sadly, not every member of the family can handle the pressure of success. My daughter Simone has completely lost her grip on reality. We tried to support her through her massive financial failures, but she repays our love with violence." He turned his cold, ruthless eyes toward me. The wealthy investors murmured among themselves, shaking their heads in sympathy for my poor, burdened father. No one questioned the wet wine stains on my dress. No one questioned the unbelievable lies spilling from my family's mouths. They had successfully built an impenetrable wall of absolute delusion. Richard signaled to the head of hotel security, who was already rushing down the hallway with 3 large men in dark suits. "Officers, please remove this woman from the premises immediately," Richard commanded, pointing a firm finger directly at my face. "She is trespassing, and she poses a physical threat to my pregnant daughter-in-law. If she resists, I want you to call the police and have her formally arrested." The security guards closed in around me, reaching out to grab my arms and physically drag me out of the luxury hotel, while my family stood there watching with cruel, calculated smirks painted across their smug, unforgiving faces, firmly believing they had successfully won this final, absolute victory tonight. Before the guard could wrap his hands around my arms, I took a sharp step forward. "Do not touch me," I commanded. My voice did not shake. It sliced through the tense silence of the hallway like a freshly sharpened blade. My composure made the guards freeze. I smoothed down the dry side of my ruined emerald gown. I turned my attention away from the hired muscle and looked directly into the sea of shocked investors and wealthy socialites standing just a few feet away. "You all love a good success story," I announced, projecting my voice so it bounced off the hotel corridor ceilings. "You are all standing here tonight, drinking top-shelf champagne to celebrate my brother Marcus, the brilliant tech visionary, the prodigal son who supposedly built this family investment fund from the ground up." My mother Evelyn let out a sharp gasp, stepping forward to block me, but I easily sidestepped her. Marcus clenched his jaw, his smug smirk completely vanishing. I locked eyes with my brother, watching the familiar cowardice bleed into his expression. "Let us talk about your very first big win, Marcus," I challenged. "Let us talk about the revolutionary logistics software platform that launched your entire career 5 years ago." Chloe opened her mouth to scream for security, but I immediately cut her off. "Be quiet, Chloe," I snapped. "Your husband is about to get the recognition he truly deserves." I stepped closer to Marcus, backing him against the pillar. "You did not write a single line of code for that platform, Marcus. You do not even know the difference between a front-end framework and a basic database query. I spent 2 entire years locked in my apartment building that algorithm from scratch. I mapped the architecture. I secured the initial beta testers. I filed the preliminary patent applications. I brought the finished business plan to our father, looking for a simple seed investment to launch the company." Marcus swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead. Richard stepped between us, his face turning crimson. "Shut your mouth, Simone." Richard growled, his voice dropping to a vicious warning. But I was not stopping. I turned back to the crowd, ensuring every single venture capitalist heard my next words clearly. My father did not invest in my company. Instead, he stole the physical servers from my workspace. He forged my signature on the intellectual property transfers, and he handed my entire life work over to his golden boy. He legally locked me out of my own creation so Marcus could parade around Silicon Valley pretending to be a genius. "You built this entire family empire on stolen goods." The crowd erupted into furious whispers. Several high-profile investors exchanged nervous glances, setting their flutes down. I expected my father to deny it vehemently. I expected him to spin another lie about my supposed instability. But Richard was so deeply intoxicated by his own perceived power that he did something far worse. He threw his head back and let out a booming, arrogant laugh. The sound echoed down the hallway, startling his own wife. "Is that what this is all about?" Richard mocked, shaking his head. "You are still crying over a few lines of code from half a decade ago." He turned to the crowd, flashing an unapologetic smile. "Ideas are completely worthless without the capital and the ruthless execution required to bring them to market. Simone had a cute little project. I simply gave it to someone who actually possessed the masculine drive to monetize it. That is not theft. That is just smart, aggressive business. And look at where that business acumen has brought us tonight." Evelyn smiled proudly, taking Richard by the arm. Marcus puffed his chest out, bolstered by our father's shameless defense. "You are living in the past, Simone." Richard continued, his tone dripping with absolute condescension. "You came here hoping to ruin our reputation with old news. But you are vastly underestimating the scale of what we have achieved. Tonight we are officially entering the major leagues." He checked his heavy gold watch, tapping the crystal face. "In exactly 5 minutes, I am signing a historic acquisition deal. I am selling 40% of our holding company to Apex Capital for a staggering $10 million. He paused, letting the massive number wash over the crowd. $10 million in liquid cash, Simone. We are partnering with the most aggressive private equity firm. You think anyone cares about your pathetic grievances? You have absolutely nothing." Richard spat, taking one step toward me to deliver his closing blow. "You are wearing a wine-stained dress, standing in a hallway shouting about ancient history while I am about to secure generational wealth. You are entirely irrelevant to my future and to the incredible legacy I am building today." A sharp buzzing sound cut through the heavy tension. Richard reached into his velvet tuxedo pocket and pulled out his phone. He glanced at the caller identification, and his arrogant smile widened into a massive, victorious grin. He held up a hand demanding silence from the crowd. "It is the Apex Capital Acquisition representative," Richard announced loudly, ensuring everyone understood the importance of the call. He swiped the glass screen and confidently answered. "Yes, speaking," he said, his voice practically vibrating with ego. "Excellent. Yes, we have the private suite ready for the signing. What is that?" He nodded eagerly, his eyes darting toward me with a look of pure malicious triumph. "Tell the chief executive officer we are waiting right by the ballroom entrance." Richard lowered the phone and turned to the security guards hovering nearby. "Change of immediate plans," Richard ordered, pointing at me. "Do not throw her out of here just yet. I want her to stay right here. I want my ungrateful daughter to stand here and watch exactly what real unstoppable power looks like when the Apex Capital Chief Executive Officer walks through those heavy doors." The security guards immediately dropped their hands, stepping back into a loose perimeter around me. They followed Richard's strict command, holding me in place without physical contact. I remained perfectly still, letting the cold red wine seep further into the silk of my dress. Evelyn let out a triumphant sigh, adjusting the heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. She looked at me with absolute pity, relishing the fact that my father had just publicly humiliated me and stripped away whatever remaining dignity she thought I possessed. Chloe leaned into Marcus, whispering something in his ear that made him chuckle. They were completely reveling in my captive state. "You really should have just stayed in your little rundown apartment, Simone," my mother whispered, her voice dripping with venom. "Now you have to stand here and watch your brother achieve everything you ever dreamed of. It is honestly pathetic." I kept my face entirely blank, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. The atmosphere in the hallway shifted rapidly. The wealthy venture capitalists and influential politicians who had gathered to watch the drama unfold began murmuring among themselves. They were no longer focused on the wine-stained woman standing behind the security guards. Their attention had completely pivoted to the massive impending financial deal my father had just proudly announced. $10 million was a staggering amount of liquid capital for a family investment fund launch. It was the kind of money that instantly cemented a legacy in the Atlanta elite circles. Richard began adjusting his velvet tuxedo jacket, smoothing the lapels, and checking his expensive gold watch for the third time in 2 minutes. He signaled to the catering staff, demanding fresh trays of top-shelf champagne be brought to the front entrance immediately. He wanted the optics of this arrival to be absolutely flawless. Marcus stepped away from his wife and joined my father, his chest puffed out with unearned arrogance. "How should we handle the initial introduction?" Dad Marcus asked loudly, ensuring the nearby investors could hear his important role. "I assume the chief executive officer will want to review the final term sheets before we move to the private suite." Richard clapped his hand firmly onto Marcus' shoulder, projecting the image of a proud, benevolent patriarch. "We will greet the chief executive officer with the utmost respect, Marcus. Apex Capital is the most aggressive and successful private equity firm in the state. They do not hand out $10 million checks to just anyone. They recognized the sheer brilliance of our logistics platform, and they want a piece of the empire we built. We will escort them directly to the VIP lounge where the lawyers are waiting." Chloe sashayed over to join them, holding her empty martini glass like a trophy. "Oh, I cannot wait to meet the person running Apex Capital," she gushed, her voice loud and grating. "I heard they operate completely in the shadows. Nobody even knows what the chief executive officer looks like. They just buy up companies and dominate the market. It is so incredibly mysterious and powerful." Evelyn smiled warmly at her daughter-in-law, linking their arms together. "It takes a certain caliber of business acumen to attract that kind of mysterious wealth, Chloe. And your husband and father-in-law possess exactly that. They are making history tonight. They are elevating this family to a tier of society that most people can only dream about." She cast a deliberate sideways glance at me, ensuring I felt the full weight of her malicious comparison. I stood quietly behind the wall of broad-shouldered security guards, listening to their grotesque display of vanity. The sheer irony of their conversation was almost too delicious to interrupt. They were actively worshipping a phantom billionaire entity, while fiercely mocking the very woman who controlled it. Every single compliment they heaped upon the shadowy figure running Apex Capital was unknowingly directed straight at me. I had spent the last 5 years building that private equity firm from absolute scratch, utilizing the seed money my grandfather had secretly entrusted to me before his health declined. I had intentionally kept my identity hidden behind layers of corporate shell companies and non-disclosure agreements to prevent my family from ever tracking my success. They thought they had secured a lifeline from a faceless corporate giant, but they had actually just walked blindly into my meticulously constructed financial slaughterhouse. A sudden flurry of activity near the main hotel entrance drew everyone's attention. The heavy brass double doors swung open, and the general manager of the St. Regis Hotel stepped into the grand foyer looking slightly frantic. He was speaking rapidly into his earpiece, scanning the crowded hallway. The whispers among the elite guests grew louder. The anticipation crackling through the air was palpable. Richard straightened his posture, his eyes gleaming with insatiable greed. He took a deep breath, readying himself to step into the ultimate spotlight. "Showtime," my father announced, turning to Marcus with a victorious grin. "Let us go greet our new business partner. Let us go secure our generational wealth." He took a confident step forward, preparing to march down the marble hallway and welcome the savior of his stolen empire. The security guards surrounding me relaxed, dropping their defensive stance. They assumed a disgraced daughter posed absolutely no threat to a historic financial signing. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the profound weight of this exact moment settle deeply into my bones. The time for hiding was officially over. I raised both my hands and firmly pushed the broad shoulders of the two large men aside. They stumbled backward, caught completely off guard by my sudden forceful movement. I stepped smoothly out of the dark shadows and directly into the bright center of the hallway, blocking my father's path. I reached down, smoothing out the front of my ruined emerald gown. "No need to welcome them," I said. "I am already here." Richard froze. He stared down at me, taking in the dark red wine dripping from my silk bodice and the absolute seriousness in my eyes. For 5 agonizing seconds, the entire hallway was dead silent. Then my father threw his head back and unleashed a booming theatrical laugh that reverberated off the marble walls. Marcus immediately joined in, chuckling as he shook his head. Chloe covered her mouth to muffle her obnoxious giggles, leaning heavily against her husband. Evelyn let out a heavy, dramatic sigh, pressing her fingers to her temples as if dealing with a petulant toddler. "You really have lost your mind, Simone," my father mocked, wiping a fake tear of amusement from his eye. "You honestly expect these highly educated venture capitalists to believe that you, a disgraced unemployed failure hiding in a rented dress, are the mastermind behind a $10 million private equity firm?" He turned to the crowd, gesturing toward me like I was a circus attraction. "Please excuse my daughter, everyone. Her delusions of grandeur have clearly reached a critical breaking point. We will get her the psychiatric help she so desperately needs right after we finalize this historic deal." He snapped his fingers at the security guards. "Get her out of my sight. Take her out through the service elevator so she does not disturb the real executives arriving at the front door." The guards moved forward again, their hands reaching out to grab my arms. I did not move an inch. I kept my gaze locked completely on my father, watching the arrogant smirk plastered across his face. Before the guards could make physical contact, the heavy brass double doors at the end of the grand foyer swung violently open. The loud crash of the metal hitting the wall echoed through the corridor, instantly freezing the security guards in their tracks. Everyone turned their heads simultaneously. A perfectly synchronized formation of 8 men and women strode into the hotel lobby. They wore immaculate, bespoke charcoal suits, projecting an intimidating aura of absolute corporate dominance. Leading the formidable group was Lawyer Sterling, my grandfather, oldest and most ruthless legal advisor. He carried a sleek, matte black titanium briefcase securely in his right hand. The group of high-powered attorneys moved with military precision, slicing right through the crowd of wealthy socialites and politicians. The Sea of Atlanta elite parted immediately, recognizing the sheer legal firepower walking among them. Richard straightened his posture instantly, abandoning his mockery of me. His arrogant smirk returned brighter than before. He assumed Lawyer Sterling had arrived to oversee the contract signing for the holding company representing my grandfather legacy. "Ah, Sterling," my father called out, taking a confident step toward the approaching legal team. "Right on time. We have the private suite completely prepped for the Apex Capital executives. Let us finalize this acquisition and make history." Lawyer Sterling did not even look at my father. He completely ignored Richard's outstretched hand, walking right past him, as if he were nothing more than a hotel bellhop. My father's arm dropped to his side, his arrogant smile faltering slightly. The entire team of corporate attorneys marched directly toward me, stopping exactly 3 feet away. In perfect unison, they offered a sharp, respectful nod. Lawyer Sterling stepped forward, stopping right in front of my wine-stained dress. He did not show an ounce of pity or concern for the ruined silk. He only saw the ultimate authority standing before him. "Good evening, Madam Chief Executive Officer," Sterling announced, his deep voice projecting clearly across the dead silent hallway. "The final execution documents for the Apex Capital acquisition are completely prepared for your exclusive review." He lifted the sleek black titanium briefcase and presented it to me with both hands. I reached out and took the heavy case, feeling the cold metal against my palms. It was the physical manifestation of 5 years of relentless, brutal execution. He blinked rapidly, entirely refusing to process the visual information playing out right in front of him. This had to be some sort of elaborate prank. He opened his mouth to order Sterling away, to demand that the senior partner explain this bizarre interruption. But the words died in his throat when he saw the unwavering deference in the lawyer posture. Sterling was a man who bowed to absolutely no one unless they held supreme power. The terrifying truth began to slowly fracture Richard's impenetrable ego. He looked down at my wine-stained dress, and for the very first time in my entire life, he actually saw me. Not the scapegoat, not the helpless daughter. He saw the apex predator who had been quietly circling his fragile glass house for 5 long, brutal years. The collective gasp from the crowd was deafening. The venture capitalists who had just been laughing with my father now stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes of pure shock. The whispers completely died out, replaced by a heavy, suffocating tension. I turned my head slowly, looking directly at my family. The color had completely drained from my father's face, leaving him a sickening shade of ash gray. His jaw hung open, completely paralyzed by the sudden horrific realization that his entire empire was built on quicksand. Marcus took a trembling step backward, hiding behind Chloe, whose face was now contorted in absolute terror. Evelyn clutched her diamond necklace, gasping for air as the reality of my identity crushed her fragile social facade. The $10 million deal, the luxurious launch party, the arrogant bragging, all of it was a carefully orchestrated trap. They had walked blindly into my slaughterhouse, and now the steel doors were locking shut behind them. I popped the metallic latches on the briefcase, the sharp clicking sound slicing through the quiet room. I pulled out a sleek digital tablet and looked up toward the audiovisual control booth located on the mezzanine level directly above the ballroom. "Switch the main presentation screens," I commanded firmly. The massive high-definition display suspended above the grand ballroom flickered for a fraction of a second. The glossy, highly edited montage of my family grinning on yachts and shaking hands at charity galas instantly vanished. In its place, a stark white document with bold black lettering illuminated the entire venue. At the very top center of the screen, the official seal of the state of Georgia sat directly beside my grandfather's personal crest. It was the master document of the irrevocable trust. I tapped the screen of my tablet, mirroring the action on the massive displays above. A bright red laser pointer effect highlighted the specific paragraph outlining the absolute transfer of assets. The booming voice of the background jazz music was abruptly cut off by the audiovisual team, leaving only the sound of my voice echoing through the state-of-the-art sound system. I turned to face the sea of venture capitalists and wealthy socialites, making sure every single person in the room heard me with absolute clarity. Ladies and gentlemen, please direct your attention to the screens above, I announced, keeping my tone perfectly measured and dangerously cold. What you are currently looking at is the foundational legal architecture of the entire empire my father has been parading around tonight. 3 years ago, my grandfather realized that his legacy was in grave danger of being completely squandered by a man driven entirely by his own ego. So he made a quiet, definitive legal maneuver to protect his life work. He transferred 100% of his holding company, including every single subsidiary real estate asset and liquid account, into a blind trust. I swiped my finger across the glass tablet. The massive screen smoothly transitioned to the second page of the document, magnifying the beneficiary section until the text was large enough for the people in the very back row to read clearly. And, as you can plainly see by the highlighted text, I continued pointing up at the glaring proof I am the sole primary beneficiary and the ultimate executive authority of that trust. The collective gasp from the audience was sharp and immediate. The wealthy investors who had just been drinking my father expensive champagne began to furiously whisper among themselves. Several high-profile corporate attorneys in the crowd pulled out their reading glasses, squinting at the screens to verify the dense legal jargon. They recognized the bulletproof structure of the document immediately. There were absolutely no loopholes. I took a slow, deliberate step toward my father. He was frozen in place, his eyes darting frantically between my face and the glowing screens above. The sweat on his forehead was now visible under the bright chandelier lights. I tapped the screen again, zooming in on my father's legal employment contract. Let us clarify the actual corporate hierarchy. I stated, my voice slicing through the heavy tension of the ballroom. Richard is not the owner of this enterprise. He is not a majority shareholder. He possesses absolutely zero equity in the holding company or any of its highly profitable subsidiaries. My father is nothing more than a salaried employee. He is a puppet chief executive officer who serves entirely at my absolute discretion. He can be terminated without cause at any given moment. I watched the blood drain completely from my mother's face. Evelyn clutched her chest, her perfectly manicured nails digging violently into her expensive diamond necklace. The illusion of her supreme Southern aristocracy was being brutally dismantled brick by brick in front of the very people she worshipped. Marcus stood completely paralyzed, his jaw hanging open as he stared at the undeniable proof that his entire professional identity was a total fabrication. I swiped the tablet to reveal the next piece of evidence. The screen flashed to show a detailed timeline comparing the creation of the trust to the exact week my family had violently kicked me out onto the street. My grandfather finalized this transfer 5 years ago, I explained, my voice echoing relentlessly through the silent room. He watched my father steal my logistics software platform to give his golden son a fake victory. My grandfather saw the bottomless greed rotting this family from the inside out, so he gave the keys to the kingdom to the only person who actually knew how to build something from absolutely nothing. The silence in the room was absolutely suffocating. The elite members of Atlanta high society were actively distancing themselves from my family, taking literal steps backward to avoid being associated with the blast radius of this public execution. I turned my attention specifically to the group of venture capitalists standing near the champagne tower. These were the men my father had been aggressively courting all evening. Gentlemen, I said, addressing them directly. I believe my father was just pitching you a rather lucrative acquisition deal. He was bragging about selling 40% of this company to Apex Capital for $10 million in liquid cash. I paused, letting the sheer gravity of that number hang in the air. The lead representative for Apex Capital, an older man with a sharp, calculating gaze, stepped forward from the crowd. He looked at the legal documents glowing on the massive screens, and then looked directly at my father. His expression shifted from professional interest to pure, unadulterated legal horror. I swiped my tablet one final time, bringing up the core operating agreement of the trust. I read the highlighted clause aloud, ensuring my voice resonated with maximum authority. Section 4, Paragraph B, explicitly states that the Chief Executive Officer has absolutely no legal authority to sell, transfer, or liquidate any shares of the holding company without the express written consent of the trust administrator. And since I have not signed a single piece of paper authorizing this ridiculous transaction, that means my father is currently attempting to sell you Heir. Richard realized he was committing massive corporate fraud live in front of federal investors. The lead representative from Apex Capital took 2 swift steps backward, pulling his smartphone from his jacket pocket to immediately contact his own legal department. Richard raised his trembling hands, trying to form a coherent sentence to stop the investors from walking out the door, but his throat was completely dry. He was looking at 20 years in a federal penitentiary for attempting to sell a corporate entity he did not legally possess. I did not waste another second watching my father suffocate under the crushing weight of his own hubris. I had entirely different targets to execute tonight. I turned my body slowly, letting the emerald silk of my gown catch the light as I locked my eyes directly onto my brother. Marcus had been trying to shrink into the background, hoping the devastating blast radius of our father's destruction would somehow miraculously pass him by. Chloe was gripping his arms so tightly her knuckles were stark white, her previous arrogance completely eradicated by the terrifying display of supreme legal authority happening right in front of her. I tapped the glossy surface of my digital tablet once again. "Change the displays." I commanded, my voice slicing cleanly through the ballroom. The massive screens hovering above the venue shifted instantly. The trust documents vanished, replaced by a glaringly bright commercial lending contract. The bold logo of Harrison Cole Private Banking Division sat proudly at the top of the paperwork. I watched Marcus physically flinch as he recognized the highly confidential document. He had signed those exact pages just 24 hours ago, believing he was cementing his status as a newly minted millionaire. "Let us redirect our attention to the supposed tech visionary of the family," I announced, gesturing up toward the illuminated screens. "Marcus has been standing at the private bar all evening, bragging to every venture capitalist who would listen about the massive capital he recently raised. He claimed he secured funding based on his brilliant business acumen and his flawless industry reputation." I tapped the tablet, magnifying the center paragraph of the banking document. "The truth, however, is far less glamorous and significantly more criminal. What you are looking at is a $10 million commercial mortgage loan application. My brother and his lovely wife Chloe applied for this massive line of credit yesterday afternoon. They bypassed the corporate channels and went straight to the private lending division, desperate for immediate liquid cash to fund their shallow vanity projects." The crowd followed my laser pointer as I highlighted the specific collateral listed on the loan documents. "In order to secure $10 million, you must provide the bank with an equivalent amount of tangible assets," I explained, walking slowly toward Marcus. My brother decided to list our grandfather's historic estate, along with 3 highly profitable commercial properties located in downtown Atlanta, as his personal collateral. He swore under penalty of perjury that he was the sole legal owner of those magnificent buildings. He even used the loan funds to pay for this very lavish launch party we are standing in right now. I stopped exactly 2 feet away from Marcus. He was sweating profusely, his chest rising and falling in rapid, panicked breaths. Chloe was shaking her eyes, darting wildly around the room, looking for an exit that did not exist. I smiled, a cold, ruthless smile that sent a visible shiver down my brother's spine. "There is just one massive, catastrophic problem with your brilliant financial strategy, Marcus," I stated clearly, ensuring the silence of the room amplified my every word. "As we established just a few moments ago, you do not own that historic estate. You do not own those commercial properties. Every single brick of that real estate belongs exclusively to my irrevocable trust. Therefore, the collateral you pledged to the bank is completely void. It is entirely invalid." The murmur that rippled through the crowd was visceral. The corporate lawyers in the room immediately recognized the sheer magnitude of the trap I had set. Marcus had knowingly pledged assets he did not possess, which constituted textbook federal bank fraud. But I was not finished dismantling his life. The bank initially flagged your fraudulent application. I continued, my voice dropping into a deadly calm register. The underwriting department saw that the properties were locked inside my trust, and they immediately blocked the transaction. But I made a quick phone call to my wealth manager. I personally authorized the bank to approve your maximum loan amount. I told them to disperse the entire $10 million directly into your private account. I watched the realization hit Marcus like a freight train. His eyes widened in absolute horror as the math finally calculated in his empty head. Because the collateral is legally invalid, the banking institution reverts to the secondary security clause I explained, projecting the specific signature page onto the screens. I highlighted Marcus' messy signature located directly beneath the bold warning text. You signed a personal guarantee, Marcus. You took $10 million of the bank money, and you spent $150,000 of it on champagne and ice sculptures tonight. The bank will demand their money back by tomorrow morning. And since you cannot surrender my houses to pay them back, they will come directly after you. You are personally on the hook for $10 million in debt. Marcus stared up at the massive screens, his entire body trembling violently. He had absolutely zero assets to his name. His cars were leased, his bank accounts were overdrawn, and the tech company he claimed to run was entirely owned by my trust. He had gleefully signed a document that financially ruined him for the rest of his natural life. He was drowning in an ocean of massive, insurmountable debt with absolutely nothing to back it up. He was drowning in an ocean of massive, insurmountable debt with absolutely nothing to back it up. The sheer magnitude of impending financial ruin finally cracked the thin veneer of loyalty between my brother and his wife. Chloe let go of Marcus' arm as if his velvet jacket had suddenly caught fire. She stumbled backward, her heels catching on the polished marble. Her eyes darted wildly between the illuminated screens and the venture capitalists who were actively recording the downfall on their cell phones. I did not know, she screamed, her voice shrill and entirely devoid of the calculated southern charm she had been projecting all evening. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at her husband's chest. He made me sign those papers. He told me it was just standard corporate protocol for the new family fund. I am just a wife. I do not know anything about commercial mortgages or irrevocable trusts. He completely manipulated me. Marcus whipped his head around, staring at Chloe in absolute disbelief. The betrayal hit him harder than the financial ruin. You were sitting right next to me in the bank manager office, Chloe, he stammered, his voice cracking under the intense pressure. You literally picked out the diamond necklace you are wearing right now, using the advance funds they wired us. Do not try to play the innocent victim here. You knew exactly what we were doing. I watched the pathetic domestic dispute unfold with cold satisfaction. Chloe was desperately attempting to sever herself from the sinking ship, throwing the man she supposedly loved directly into the churning propellers. She clasped her hands together in a praying motion, turning her tear-filled eyes toward the wealthy investors and politicians surrounding us. Please, you have to believe me, Chloe begged, her voice shaking with manufactured terror. I am completely innocent in all of this. I trusted my husband, and he took advantage of my blind faith. I would never knowingly participate in bank fraud. I did not even know the grandfather estate was locked in a trust. I am a victim of his aggressive financial abuse. I let her spin her desperate web of lies for exactly 30 seconds before I raised my hand, signaling the audiovisual team in the control booth. Your commitment to playing the helpless damsel is truly remarkable, Chloe. I announced, my voice easily cutting through her theatrical sobbing. But as I mentioned earlier, I do not rely on emotions or accusations. I rely entirely on receipts. Play the security footage. The massive screens above the ballroom shifted once again. The banking documents vanished, completely replaced by crisp, high-definition color video. The timestamp in the bottom right corner indicated the footage was captured exactly 3 weeks ago. The camera angle provided a clear, unobstructed view of a dimly lit coffee shop located on the outskirts of downtown Atlanta. The crowd in the ballroom went dead silent, craning their necks to watch the silent film play out. The video clearly showed Chloe sitting in a secluded corner booth. She was wearing oversized sunglasses and a large trench coat looking like a terrible cliché from a cheap spy movie. Across the table from her sat a notorious local forger, a man well known in the underground circles for recreating legal signatures with terrifying accuracy. I had hired private investigators to track every single movement my family made the moment they threw me out of my grandfather's house. My team had intercepted the coffee shop security feed within hours of the meeting. Look closely, everyone, I instructed, pointing my laser at the massive screen. Notice how the innocent manipulated wife is eagerly sliding a thick manila envelope across the table. The footage showed the forger opening the envelope and pulling out my grandfather's original signature samples. Then Chloe reached into her designer handbag and pulled out two thick stacks of $100 bills, pushing them aggressively toward the man. She was visibly mouthing strict instructions, pointing emphatically at the blank deed transfer documents she needed him to fabricate. "You did not just passively sign a bank loan, Chloe," I stated, my tone dripping with absolute lethal authority. "You actively orchestrated the forgery of my grandfather's legal signature. You personally paid a criminal thousands of dollars in untraceable cash to manufacture the fraudulent documents you used to seize my estate. You are not a victim of financial abuse. You are the chief architect of a federal felony." The video looped, playing the undeniable exchange of cash for forged documents over and over again on the massive overhead displays. Chloe's face went completely slack. The fake tears instantly dried up, replaced by the raw primal terror of a woman realizing she was going to spend the best years of her life wearing a bright orange jumpsuit in a federal penitentiary. The heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone suddenly looked very much like a sparkling, expensive noose. But Chloe was not ready to surrender. Her survival instinct kicked into overdrive, and she resorted to the only weapon she had left in her pathetic arsenal. She dropped to her knees right there on the cold marble floor of the St. Regis ballroom. She threw her head back and let out a guttural, agonizing wail. It was the absolute pinnacle of white tears, a performance designed to weaponize her fragility and force everyone in the room to rush to her immediate rescue. "Please," she sobbed hysterically, burying her face in her hands. "I was so scared. They forced me to do it. They told me I would lose my baby if I did not help them secure the money. You are all attacking me. Why is everyone attacking me?" She looked up through her fingers, expecting the wealthy crowd to rally around her, expecting the security guards to intervene, expecting anyone to coddle her and validate her victimhood. But she had fundamentally miscalculated the demographics of the room she was currently attempting to manipulate. The black elite of Atlanta did not rush forward to offer Chloe comfort. They did not offer her a shoulder to cry on or a handkerchief to dry her eyes. Instead, they looked down at her writhing on the marble floor with absolute, unadulterated disgust. These were men and women who had spent their entire lives fighting through systemic barriers to build their massive fortunes. They recognized the weaponization of her manufactured hysteria instantly. The wealthy politicians and powerful executives simply took another collective step backward, leaving Chloe completely isolated in the center of the grand ballroom. Her theatrical sobbing echoed hollowly against the cold, silent walls of the St. Regis Hotel. She realized no one was coming to save her. I stepped forward, my emerald gown sweeping gracefully across the floor. I stood directly over her, looking down at the pathetic display of a woman who had tried to steal my birthright. "Save your tears, Chloe," I commanded, my voice echoing with an icy finality that instantly silenced her fake wailing. "Your predictable performance might work on the local police department, but it is going to fail miserably against the federal government. The IRS and the FBI are currently waiting in the main lobby downstairs." The words hit the room like a physical shockwave. Marcus staggered backward, bumping into the champagne tower and sending a dozen crystal flutes crashing to the floor. The shattering glass punctuated the sheer terror washing over his face. "You called the feds!" Marcus gasped, his voice cracking as he clutched his chest. "You cannot do that, Simone. We are your blood. I did not call them today, Marcus. I corrected him, my gaze shifting to my terrified brother. I called them 3 weeks ago, the very morning after you broke into my house and threw my belongings onto the lawn. I handed over the forged deeds, the falsified loan applications, and the security footage of Chloe paying off a known criminal. The federal agents have been quietly building a massive wire fraud and tax evasion case against both of you. They were just waiting for you to officially sign the final loan documents yesterday to seal your undeniable guilt. Richard let out a strangled, horrific gasp. The arrogant patriarch who had spent the entire evening boasting about his generational wealth finally understood the catastrophic reality of his situation. His legs gave out completely. My father collapsed heavily onto his knees, the expensive velvet tuxedo pooling around him on the polished marble. He stared blankly at the floor, his hands shaking violently as the magnitude of his absolute failure crushed his fragile ego. He had lost the company, he had lost the estate, and now he was about to lose his freedom. The man who had sneered at my thrift store clothes and slammed a mahogany door in my face was now kneeling helplessly at my feet. Evelyn could no longer maintain her pristine Southern aristocratic facade. My mother broke away from the crowd and rushed toward me, her dark purple ball gown rustling frantically. She grabbed my arm, her perfectly manicured fingers trembling as she looked up at the glowing screens displaying their undeniable crimes. "Simone, please, you have to stop this presentation immediately," Evelyn begged, her voice thick with genuine panic. "You are destroying us. You are completely destroying our entire legacy. We will lose everything. The country club will ban us. The church will excommunicate us. We will be publicly ruined." I looked down at the woman who had slapped my face and called me a monster just 1 month ago. "You destroyed your own legacy, Mother," I stated coldly, pulling my arm out of her desperate grip. "You chose a fake image over your own daughter. You stood by and proudly clapped while my father publicly humiliated me in a cathedral. You watched Chloe and Marcus steal my home, and you cheered them on. You are not begging for forgiveness right now. You are simply begging to avoid the consequences of your own bottomless greed." Evelyn fell to her knees right beside my broken father. She clasped her hands together, tears ruining her expensive makeup as she looked up at me. "We are your family, Simone," she pleaded hysterically. "You cannot send your own father and your only brother to a federal prison. Please, I am begging you. We will do whatever you want. We will give you the house back. We will leave Atlanta. Just please tell the federal agents in the lobby to leave us alone. Do not let them put us in handcuffs tonight." I stood tall, looking at the 4 people who had relentlessly tormented me my entire life. They were all broken, terrified, and entirely stripped of their unearned power. The venture capitalists and politicians watched in stunned silence, witnessing the absolute annihilation of the Richard and Marcus Family Investment Fund. I had successfully executed the most brutal financial retaliation imaginable. I had completely shattered their world. I turned my head and gave a sharp, precise nod to Lawyer Sterling. The towering attorney stepped forward, immediately opening his sleek titanium briefcase once more. He pulled out a thick legal document bound in a dark leather folder and handed it directly to me. I looked down at the terrified faces of my parents, my brother, and his wife. "The federal agents are waiting for my signal," I announced, my voice devoid of any warmth or mercy. "I will not send you to federal prison tonight, but my leniency comes with a devastating price." I dropped the heavy leather folder directly onto the marble floor right in front of my kneeling father. The loud smack of the thick binding hitting the ground made Marcus flinch violently. I crossed my arms over my chest, staring down at their ruined, pathetic kingdom. "You have exactly 2 minutes to carefully read and securely sign this final corporate contract before I formally make the single call that ruins your lives forever." Richard reached out with a trembling hand and pulled the heavy leather folder into his lap. He flipped open the cover, his eyes frantically scanning the dense legal text. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. Even the venture capitalists and the elite politicians held their breath, watching the complete systematic dismantling of a so-called corporate titan. I watched my father reading the pages. I saw the exact moment his brain comprehended the brutal, unapologetic reality of my terms. His shoulders slumped, and a low, guttural sound of pure defeat escaped his throat. "What does it say?" Evelyn demanded, her voice cracking as she leaned over his shoulder. Richard could not even speak. He just stared at the pristine white paper as if it were written in a foreign language. "Allow me to summarize the terms for the rest of the group," I announced, projecting my voice clearly across the marble floor. "By signing that legally binding document, you are agreeing to completely forfeit every single remaining personal asset you currently possess. You will transfer the immediate ownership of your luxury cars, your designer jewelry, your private investment portfolios, and the deed to your Atlanta penthouse directly into my holding company. You will surrender every last dime you have hoarded over the past 5 years to completely offset the massive fraudulent debt you carelessly incurred yesterday." Evelyn gasped, clutching the diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. "You cannot possibly mean everything," she cried out, looking at me with wild, desperate eyes. "We will have absolutely nothing left, Simone. Where are we supposed to live? How are we supposed to survive?" "You will survive the exact same way I survived when you threw me out onto the street," I replied coldly. "You will find a cheap apartment. You will get a minimum wage job. You will learn how to budget for basic groceries. You are not above the harsh reality of the real-world mother. The only difference is that I built my empire through sheer, relentless hard work, while you built your fragile glass house entirely on stolen funds and pathetic lies." I turned my attention to Chloe, who was still sitting on the marble floor shivering in her ruined designer dress. "That specifically includes the jewelry you are wearing right now, Chloe." I stated, my gaze locked onto her neck. "The engagement ring, the diamond earrings, the tennis bracelet. All of it was purchased using the stolen mortgage funds from my grandfather's estate. You will take them off and place them directly into Lawyer Sterling's briefcase before you walk out of this hotel." Chloe let out a strangled sob, wrapping her arms around her torso, but she did not dare argue. The threat of federal prison had completely eradicated her usual arrogant defiance. "But the asset transfer is only the first half of the agreement." I continued, tapping my digital tablet to display the final page of the contract on the massive overhead screens. "The second half is a comprehensive, legally binding confession of fraud. You will officially admit on the public record that you knowingly forged my grandfather's signature. You will admit that you intentionally stole my logistics software platform 5 years ago. You will confess to engaging in systematic financial manipulation to seize control of my irrevocable trust." Richard finally looked up from the leather folder, his eyes bloodshot and filled with a mixture of terror and lingering pride. "You are forcing us to sign a public confession," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "You are intentionally stripping away our dignity. If we sign this, we will never be able to show our faces in this city again. No bank will ever lend to us. No country club will ever accept us. We will be social pariahs." "You made yourselves social pariahs the moment you decided to commit federal felonies," I corrected him sharply. "I am simply providing the documentation. That confession is my permanent insurance policy. It ensures that you will never try to sue me, retaliate against me, or spin another pathetic false narrative to the media. It guarantees that you will quietly disappear into the shadows where you belong." Lawyer Sterling stepped forward, holding out 4 sleek silver pens. He offered them to my kneeling family members, his face an impenetrable mask of legal authority. "You have exactly 60 seconds remaining to execute the document," he stated, checking his expensive timepiece. Richard reached up with a shaking hand and took the first pen. He looked utterly broken, a man completely stripped of his unearned power. Evelyn took the second pen, sobbing quietly as she realized her reign over Atlanta high society was permanently finished. Chloe took the third pen, her hands trembling so violently she nearly dropped it onto the marble floor. Lawyer Sterling held out the final pen toward Marcus. My brother had been standing frozen this entire time, staring at the screens above us. His face was twisted into a dark, ugly mask of raw fury. He looked at the silver pen, then looked at the heavy leather folder resting on the floor. He slowly raised his eyes to meet mine. His chest heaved with heavy, aggressive breaths. "No, Marcus," growled, his voice echoing through the silent ballroom. Everyone in the crowd tensed. Richard turned his head, looking at his son in absolute panic. Marcus signed the paper, my father pleaded desperately. We have no other choice. I am not signing anything, Marcus shouted, slapping the pen out of Lawyer Sterling's hand. It clattered loudly across the polished marble floor. You cannot do this, Simone. You cannot take everything we own and leave us with absolutely nothing. I am the son of this family. I deserve a piece of the legacy. I will not let you strip me of my dignity and force me to live like a peasant just because you got lucky with some secret trust fund. You are bluffing. You would never actually send your own flesh and blood to a federal prison. Marcus stepped forward, puffing his chest out in a final, pathetic attempt to assert his dominance. He thought he could call my bluff. He genuinely believed that the invisible bonds of toxic family loyalty would somehow magically save him from the severe consequences of his own actions. I did not argue with him. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached into my emerald silk gown and pulled out my smartphone. I unlocked the screen and tapped the direct contact number for the lead federal agent waiting in the lobby downstairs. I pressed the phone to my ear, maintaining absolute dead eye contact with my brother as the line began to ring. The phone rang once. It rang twice. The sharp, piercing sound of the dial tone echoed from the small speaker of my smartphone. Marcus stood his ground for exactly 2 seconds before his false bravado completely shattered. The rigid posture of the golden child evaporated, leaving behind a terrified little boy staring at the devastating consequences of his own arrogance. He lunged forward, reaching out with trembling hands as if he could physically grab the cellular signal out of the air. Please, he choked out his voice, fracturing into a desperate, pathetic whine. Please do not do this. Before the federal agent on the other end could answer, my mother threw herself across the polished marble floor. Evelyn crawled frantically toward me, her dark purple couture gown gathering dust and spilled champagne. She grabbed my ankles, her perfectly manicured fingers digging into my skin. She looked up at me with wild mascara-stained eyes. Simone, hang up that phone right now. Evelyn shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings of the ballroom. You are tearing this family apart. We are your blood. We are your own flesh and blood. You cannot do this to your own family. I looked down at the woman clinging to my legs. The sheer audacity of her manipulation was almost breathtaking. She was attempting to use the very concept of family as a weapon to shield her favorite child from a federal indictment. I lowered the phone from my ear, but I did not end the call. I simply placed my thumb over the microphone, keeping the line wide open. Family. I repeated the word, tasting like poison on my tongue. You want to talk about blood and family right now? Let us talk about family, Evelyn. I stepped back, forcing her to release my ankles. Where was this desperate familial loyalty 5 years ago, when you and Richard threw me out of your house in the dead of winter? I was suffering from severe clinical depression. I was drowning in the financial ruin your husband caused when he stole my software patent. I came to you begging for a place to sleep. And what did you tell me, Mother? Evelyn scrambled to her knees, opening her mouth to fabricate another lie, but I did not give her the chance to speak. I raised my voice, ensuring every single wealthy investor and corporate attorney in the grand ballroom heard the absolute truth. You told me I was a stain on the family aesthetic, I stated clearly. You told me that allowing a depressed, broke daughter to live in your pristine mansion would ruin your upcoming spread in a luxury lifestyle magazine. You chose a magazine photo shoot over your own daughter surviving the winter. You watched me walk out into the freezing rain with nothing but a single suitcase, and you securely locked the deadbolt behind me. My mother covered her face with her hands, sobbing loudly into her palms. The surrounding crowd shifted uncomfortably, absolutely disgusted by the horrific reality of the woman they had been socializing with all evening. And where was this blood loyalty when you actively supported Marcus as he paraded my stolen software platform around Silicon Valley? I demanded, turning my cold gaze back to my brother. You all knew he did not write that code. You knew he could not even explain the basic algorithms running the system. But you threw lavish parties for him. You bought him luxury cars and expensive watches using the profits from my stolen labor. You intentionally erased my existence so you could build a fake corporate prodigy to impress your country club friends. Richard stared at the floor, entirely unable to make eye contact with me. Marcus kept his head down, silently weeping as the heavy, crushing weight of his absolute failure finally broke his spirit. "You do not care about blood," I continued, my voice dropping into a deadly calm register that commanded total silence in the massive room. "You care about image. You care about the illusion of black excellence. You care about designer labels and VIP access and maintaining a fake hierarchy where you get to look down on everyone else. You only care about family when you need a convenient shield to hide behind after committing federal crimes." Evelyn looked up at me, her face twisted in pure desperation. "We made terrible mistakes, Simone," she cried out, clasping her hands together. "We were blinded by the money and the status. But we can change. We can be a real family now. Just give us a chance to prove it. Please do not send your brother to a cold prison cell. We will do whatever you ask. We will sign the asset transfer documents immediately. Just let us walk out of this hotel together as a family." I stared at the pathetic group of people kneeling before me. They were completely stripped of their unearned power, their fake wealth, and their toxic arrogance. They were finally experiencing the exact same helpless terror they had inflicted on me for my entire life. I lifted my thumb off the microphone of my smartphone. "Agent," I said, speaking clearly into the device. "The targets have agreed to sign the asset forfeiture documents and the full confession of corporate fraud. You can stand down your arrest teams for now. I will have my legal counsel forward the signed confessions to your office by tomorrow morning." I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my gown. Marcus let out a loud, gasping breath of relief, collapsing onto his hands and knees. Evelyn cried out, thanking me profusely, praising my mercy, and claiming she knew I still loved them deep down. But I was not finished. I turned to Lawyer Sterling, who was standing quietly beside me. He opened his sleek titanium briefcase one last time. He pulled out a single pristine white document bound in a thick blue legal folder. He handed it to me with a respectful nod. "I do not want your gratitude," I stated coldly, looking down at my mother. "And we will never be a family again. I am not letting you avoid prison because I care about you. I am letting you avoid prison because a messy public federal trial would temporarily disrupt the stock price of my holding company. Your freedom is simply a calculated business decision." I stepped forward and dropped the thick blue folder directly onto the marble floor right next to the asset transfer contract. "Sign the financial forfeiture," I commanded. "Sign the confession of fraud. And then you will sign this final document." Richard reached out with a trembling hand, pulling the blue folder toward him. "What is this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I looked down at the men and women who had tormented me my entire life. I offered them a chilling, serene smile that completely shattered their remaining hopes of future reconciliation. "That is a permanent legal restraining order," I announced, my voice echoing with finality. "You will never come within 500 feet of me, my properties, or my corporate offices ever again." The blue folder containing the restraining order sat on the polished marble floor, looking as dangerous as a venomous snake preparing to strike. The paper demanded a total and permanent severance. If they signed it, they were legally acknowledging that their presence in my life was a verifiable threat to my safety and well-being. It entirely stripped away their final delusion that they could somehow manipulate their way back into my good graces once the dust finally settled. Evelyn let out a sharp gasp, pressing both hands aggressively against her mouth. She finally understood the absolute finality of my terms. There would be no holiday reconciliations. There would be no tearful family reunions orchestrated for social media validation. There would be absolutely no access to the billions of dollars I currently controlled. They were being permanently exiled from the paradise they thought they had brilliantly stolen. "Sign the documents," Richard first commanded, my voice entirely devoid of any emotion. "The federal agents are highly impatient people. I will not ask you to pick up that pen again." My father looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot and completely devoid of the arrogant spark that had defined his entire existence. The great patriarch of the family, the man who had demanded perfection and ruthlessly punished perceived failure, was completely broken. He reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the silver pen. His fingers slipped twice against the smooth metal casing before he finally managed a solid grip. He opened the heavy leather folder and signed his name on the financial forfeiture agreement. He signed the full confession of corporate fraud. And finally, he signed the permanent restraining order. His signature was usually a bold, aggressive scrawl, but today it was weak and jagged. It was the signature of a completely defeated man. Richard pushed the folders toward my mother. Evelyn looked at the pages, her chest heaving with heavy, frantic breaths. She looked up at me intensely, searching my face for even a single ounce of hesitation or mercy. She found absolutely nothing. My expression was carved from solid ice. Evelyn picked up the pen and signed her name, her tears leaving dark, wet splotches on the pristine legal documents. She relinquished her luxury cars, her designer jewelry, and the penthouse she loved significantly more than her own daughter. She traded her entire fake empire for her freedom. Evelyn shoved the documents toward Marcus. My brother stared at the papers, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might physically shatter. He had spent his entire life coasting smoothly on my stolen ideas and our father unearned praise. Now he had to legally admit that he was a total fraud. Marcus gripped the pen and signed the confession, pressing down so hard he nearly tore right through the thick parchment. He signed away his future, his fake reputation, and his ability to ever come near me again. Finally, Marcus slid the folder across the marble floor to Chloe. His wife was shaking violently. She looked at Marcus, expecting him to somehow protect her to fix the catastrophic nightmare they had blindly plunged into. But Marcus did not even look at her. He stared blankly at the floor, completely consumed by his own monumental failure. Chloe let out a pathetic, whimpering sound. She took the pen and hastily scribbled her signature on every single line. With trembling hands, she unclasped the heavy diamond necklace from her throat. She pulled the diamond earrings from her ears and slipped the massive engagement ring off her finger. She placed the glittering jewelry directly into the open briefcase held by Lawyer Sterling. The stolen diamonds clattered loudly against the metal interior. Lawyer Sterling stepped forward and systematically collected the signed documents. He meticulously reviewed each page, ensuring every single signature and initial was perfectly placed. He nodded once, confirming the execution was flawless. He placed the heavy legal folders into the titanium briefcase and snapped the locks shut. The sharp metallic click echoed through the silent ballroom, finalizing the absolute transfer of power. My grandfather's empire was completely secured. The toxic parasites had been surgically removed from my life. I did not yell. I did not cry. I did not launch into an emotional monologue about how much they had hurt me over the years. They did not deserve my tears, and they certainly did not deserve any more of my precious time. I simply looked at the four pathetic figures kneeling on the floor of the luxurious St. Regis ballroom. I reached into the small clutch purse I carried and pulled out one final piece of paper. It was not a legal document. It was a simple, itemized receipt. I dropped the paper onto the marble floor right next to my father's knee. "That is the final invoice for this spectacular launch party," I announced, my voice ringing with crystal-clear authority. "The venue, the catering, the champagne tower, and the custom ice sculptures total exactly $150,000. Since you no longer have access to my corporate accounts or the fraudulent mortgage loan, you will need to figure out how to settle this tab by the end of the night. I suggest you start calling whoever is left in your contact list, because the hotel management is well aware that your credit cards are currently bouncing." I did not wait for their response. I turned my back on my parents, my brother, and his wife. I smoothed the skirt of my emerald gown and began walking toward the main exit of the ballroom. Lawyer Sterling and the formidable team of corporate attorneys formed a tight protective wedge around me, moving in perfect synchronization. The wealthy venture capitalists and elite politicians parted like the Red Sea, allowing me to walk unhindered through the grand space. I had taken exactly 10 steps toward the heavy brass doors when the fragile alliance behind me completely detonated. The terrifying silence of the ballroom was shattered by a vicious screaming match. "This is entirely your fault, Richard," my mother shrieked, her voice cracking with pure venom. "You told us the plan was foolproof. You ruined my life. You ruined everything." My father roared back, his voice thick with rage and humiliation. "Shut your mouth, Evelyn. You enabled this just as much as I did. You were the one pushing for the bigger lifestyle." Over there screaming, I heard Chloe sobbing loudly, hitting Marcus' chest. "I am divorcing you, Marcus," she wailed. "I am not going down with your pathetic family. I am leaving you tomorrow." Marcus shouted curses at his wife, blaming her greed for accelerating their massive downfall. They were tearing each other apart like cornered, starving animals. The facade of their perfect, loving family had completely vaporized, exposing the toxic, rotting core underneath. They had absolutely no one left to blame but themselves, and they were completely incapable of handling the crushing weight of their own consequences. I did not stop walking. I did not turn around to watch the carnage. I kept my head held incredibly high, my posture radiating absolute victory. I pushed through the heavy brass double doors and stepped out into the cool, refreshing Atlanta night air. Behind me, the screaming continued to echo through the luxury hotel, but it sounded very distant now. It sounded like a nightmare I had finally woken up from. The heavy burden I had carried for my entire life was completely gone. I stepped toward my waiting Maybach, ready to build a new world. I slid into the back of my Maybach as the driver closed the heavy door, sealing me away from the toxic noise of my former family. The engine purred to life, carrying me toward a future I completely controlled. That night marked the absolute end of their reign, and the undeniable beginning of mine. Exactly 6 months passed since the grand ballroom became the site of their complete financial execution. The fallout was swift, brutal, and entirely of their own making. The natural consequences of their bottomless greed did all the heavy lifting for me. Lawyer Sterling kept me updated on the wreckage purely for security purposes, ensuring our ironclad agreement was strictly enforced. The rapid disintegration of my brother's marriage was the first domino to fall. Chloe filed for a highly publicized divorce less than 48 hours after the gala. She hired an aggressive attorney intending to take half of whatever Marcus had left. But the terrifying reality of his financial situation quickly set in. Marcus had absolutely zero assets, and a massive mountain of debt with his messy signature firmly stamped on it. Chloe's aggressive divorce strategy yielded exactly nothing. Because she had signed away her stolen jewelry, she walked away with nothing but a damaged reputation and mounting legal fees. Last week, my investigator confirmed the former aspiring socialite is now working full-time at a mid-tier retail clothing store. She spends her days folding cheap sweaters and dealing with rude customers just to pay off her criminal defense attorneys. Her dreams of limitless generational wealth ended with a polyester uniform. Marcus fared even worse in the brutal aftermath. Without my logistics software platform, his tech visionary persona completely vaporized overnight. The venture capitalists who witnessed his public humiliation blacklisted him across the entire technology industry. He was forced to declare total personal bankruptcy, his credit score completely obliterated by the massive fraudulent loan. He currently lives in a rented, windowless basement room, scraping by on low-level contract coding jobs he is barely qualified to perform. His unearned arrogance was entirely stripped away, leaving a hollow shell of a man who finally understands he is nothing without his brilliant sister. But the most devastating downfall belonged to my parents. For Richard and Evelyn, the loss of their wealth was painful, but losing their social status was absolute torture. The elite megachurch where they paraded their fake piety quietly excommunicated them. The pastor, citing their public admission of corporate fraud, requested they never return. Their exclusive country club membership was revoked almost immediately after their credit cards bounced. The friends they had bought with lavish parties vanished into thin air, entirely unwilling to associate with convicted fraudsters. Stripped of their luxury vehicles, their pristine penthouse, and their stolen empire, my parents were violently forced to face the harsh reality I promised them. They now reside in a cramped, heavily outdated studio apartment on the far industrial outskirts of the city. There are no polished marble floors or sparkling crystal chandeliers. There is only peeling yellow linoleum, leaking faucets, and the deafening silence of their own monumental regrets. They spend their days trapped inside that tiny, suffocating box, bitterly blaming each other for their spectacular collapse. My mother, who once scoffed at my thrift store jeans, now shops at discount grocery stores late at night, keeping her head down to avoid being recognized by anyone from her former glamorous life. The pristine image of black excellence they so viciously protected has been completely erased from Atlanta high society. I ensured they faced no federal prison time solely because doing so protected my corporate assets from a messy public trial. But the invisible prison they currently inhabit is vastly more punishing than any concrete cell. They have to wake up every single morning and remember that they had the keys to an incredible empire, but lost it all because they chose greed over their own daughter. Late one rainy Tuesday evening, Richard sat on the edge of a sagging mattress in his dismal studio apartment. The damp walls of the cramped room felt like they were closing in on him. He stared down at a cheap prepaid smartphone, the only device he could currently afford. The screen cast a harsh artificial glow against his deeply lined, exhausted face. Desperation clawed at his chest, a suffocating weight he could no longer ignore. He had lost his wife, respect his son's future, and his entire identity. He desperately needed a lifeline. He needed the one person he had ruthlessly thrown out into the cold. With trembling fingers, Richard pulled up his contact list and scrolled down to my name. He hesitated, his pride fighting a losing battle against his absolute despair. He finally pressed the green call button, bringing the plastic phone to his ear. He closed his eyes, rehearsing a pathetic apology, hoping to manipulate my empathy one last time. He waited for the ring. He waited for his daughter to answer. He waited for a second chance. Instead, a harsh, automated voice echoed through the cheap speaker, cutting through the silence of his miserable apartment. "We are sorry. The number you have reached has been permanently disconnected and is no longer in service." The finality of that robotic voice crushed the last remaining shred of his false hope. Richard dropped the cheap phone onto the peeling linoleum floor, burying his face in his trembling hands. He wept bitterly alone in the dark, knowing he could never undo the damage he caused. My empire continued to expand, reaching new unprecedented heights of financial success, while the people who tried to bury me were completely forgotten by the world. They were permanently exiled, left to rot in the absolute destruction they built for themselves. I never looked back. I never answered their letters. I kept building my legacy, proving that the ultimate revenge is a highly successful life lived entirely without them. They became nothing but invisible ghosts. I stood in the center of my massive corner office on the 60th floor of the Apex Capitol Tower. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered an unobstructed panoramic view of the glittering Atlanta skyline. The bright city lights stretched out endlessly below me, resembling a vast, glittering ocean of pure gold and silver. This was my own beautiful and expanding corporate kingdom. I had built this pristine sanctuary, brick by brick, utilizing nothing but my own sheer willpower and the quiet genius my grandfather had secretly recognized. The heavy oak doors to my private suite were wide open, allowing the soft melodic sounds of live jazz and the delicate clinking of crystal to drift into my workspace. I was hosting a private catered dinner tonight, but the guest list was incredibly exclusive. There were no fake socialites, no greedy politicians, and absolutely no toxic blood relatives. The people gathered in my private dining room tonight were my true chosen family. I walked out of my office and stepped into the softly lit dining area. Seated around the long custom mahogany table were the remarkable individuals who had fiercely protected me when I had absolutely nothing. At the head of the table sat Lawyer Sterling, nursing a glass of 20-year-old scotch. He was no longer just my legal counsel, he was my most trusted advisor and a fierce mentor who had guided my hand through the darkest corporate wars. Beside him sat Maya, the brilliant lead developer who had helped me rebuild my logistics software from scratch after my father stole the original code. Across from her was David, the angel investor, who had looked at a depressed, evicted young woman 5 years ago and saw a ruthless visionary worthy of his capital. These people did not demand my compliance or weaponize their support. They demanded my excellence and rewarded my hard work with unshakable loyalty. They never asked me to shrink myself to make them comfortable. They built me up when my biological parents actively tried to tear me down. The atmosphere in the room was warm, genuine, and completely devoid of the suffocating pretension that had defined my previous life. Maya leaned her head back, laughing loudly at a dry joke Sterling had just delivered. David was slicing into a perfectly cooked Wagyu steak, praising my private chef. There was absolutely no suffocating anxiety hanging heavily in the air here tonight. We were simply enjoying the beautiful fruits of our highly successful labor. There was no desperate need to perform for an invisible audience or impress a room full of judgmental strangers. I watched them interact, feeling a profound sense of peace settle deeply into my chest. I had successfully replaced the chaotic screaming matches and the endless gaslighting with intelligent conversation and mutual respect. I had surgically excised the cancer of my toxic upbringing and cultivated an environment where only authenticity could thrive. My mother used to say that a woman without her family was entirely defenseless. She was dead wrong. A woman who meticulously handpicks her inner circle based on merit and integrity is absolutely invincible. They were the solid foundation I had always deserved. I excused myself for a brief moment and walked back into the quiet sanctuary of my corner office. I walked past my massive glass desk and stopped in front of the custom shelving unit built directly into the wall. Resting on the center shelf, illuminated by a single warm spotlight, was a simple silver picture frame. Inside the frame was a faded photograph of my grandfather. It was taken decades ago, long before the money and the status corrupted his son. In the picture, he was wearing a dusty work shirt, standing proudly in front of his very first commercial property. He had a tough, relentless look in his eyes, the exact same look I saw in the mirror every single morning. He knew the heavy burden of building an empire from dirt. He knew the absolute danger of handing immense power to lazy, entitled people. He had watched my father tear me apart, and he had quietly handed me the ultimate weapon to fight back. He had given me the ultimate trust and the absolute freedom to finally conquer my own destiny. I reached out and gently touched the cool metal frame, feeling an overwhelming surge of gratitude and fierce pride. I had completely honored his monumental legacy, ensuring that his brilliant vision would successfully outlive the deeply toxic generation that aggressively tried to blindly consume it and destroy it from the inside out. I had brutally protected his lifework from being liquidated for cheap champagne and fake prestige. I had transformed his secret trust into a formidable private equity juggernaut that commanded absolute respect across the entire nation. My father and my brother had tried to bury me in the dirt, but they did not realize I was a seed. I picked up my crystal flute of vintage champagne from my desk, feeling the delicate bubbles rising to the surface. I turned around and walked back out into the elegant dining room. The lively conversation immediately paused as I approached the head of the heavy mahogany table. My chosen family looked up at me, their eyes reflecting genuine admiration and unwavering support. They knew the brutal psychological war I had just won, and they were immensely proud to stand in the exclusive winner circle right alongside me. I raised my crystal flute high into the air, the sparkling liquid catching the ambient light of the beautiful room. I looked at the incredible, intelligent people surrounding me, and then I looked back toward the open door of my office where my grandfather photo rested in the warm light. I offered a sharp, victorious smile, letting the absolute certainty of my hard-won freedom radiate through my entire being. Blood makes you related, I announced, my voice ringing with absolute, undeniable power. But loyalty and receipts make you family. The story of Simone serves as a powerful testament to one of the most difficult but liberating lessons in life. Biological ties do not obligate you to endure toxic behavior, and true family is built on a foundation of mutual respect and loyalty rather than just blood. From a young age, many of us are conditioned to believe that we must endlessly forgive and accommodate our relatives regardless of how deeply they wound us. Simone and her journey completely shatter this dangerous illusion. When her parents and brother repeatedly chose social status, ego, and greed over her well being, she did not simply fold under the heavy weight of their rejection. Instead, she recognized her own inherent value and walked away to build a massive empire entirely on her own terms. The profound lesson here is that our self worth is not determined by those who are unable or unwilling to see it. When we desperately chase the conditional approval of manipulative people, we sacrifice our own peace and potential. Simone teaches us that establishing firm and non negotiable boundaries is not an act of cruelty, but rather the ultimate act of self preservation. By stepping out of her toxic family shadow and securing her own independence, she demonstrated that we have the power to rewrite our own narratives. We do not have to remain the victims or the forgotten scapegoats in someone else's twisted game. We can choose to surround ourselves with a chosen family who celebrates our authentic selves and supports us without hidden agendas or malicious motives. Ultimately, healing begins the exact moment we stop waiting for an apology that will never come and start giving ourselves the respect we rightfully deserve. Take a moment today to evaluate the relationships in your life and have the courage to set the firm boundaries necessary to protect your own peace.